Hello, welcome back to the lecture series on literary criticism. Today we look into Philip Sidney's criticism in detail with respect to his critical work, Apology for Poetry. So, we already have dealt with Renaissance criticism and Sidney's contributions to literature. So now we'll move on to, as mentioned earlier, we'll move on to his critical contributions in detail. So, it is for the first time in the period of Renaissance that English criticism develops itself. And for the beginnings of modern literary criticism, we definitely have to look into the 14th and 15th centuries, especially to the contributions from Italy and all. These can be considered as the formative periods of Renaissance, which had drawn its inspiration from the revival of learning and the renewed study of the classical literature of ancient Greece and Rome. Sidney is indeed the father of English literary criticism, just as Chaucer is the father of English poetry. The Apology is that first important landmark in the history of literary criticism in England and an epitome of whatever was significant in the medieval tradition as well as the contemporary. Deeply colored, though it is with the eclectic temper of the age and its didactic bias, its intrinsic and lasting value as the first piece of English criticism cannot go uncounted. So, coming to the work, An Apology for Poetry or the Defense of Poesy is a philosophical treatise which touches on questions of form, of technique, and of matter in poetry. It was approximately written in 1580 and published only in 1595 after Sidney's death. The immediate cause of Sidney's writing the essay was the publication of The School of Abuse in 1579 by Stephen Gosson, which was unauthorizedly dedicated to Sidney and questioned the morality of poetry and other forms of literature. And this person, Stephen Gosson, was an absolute Puritan, so his Puritan ideas were reflected in his work. Apology was written in the 16th century Renaissance literary climate that was concerned about aesthetic problems regarding the object and purpose of poetry itself. Thus, unlike Thomas Lodge's defense of poetry, Sidney's apology is much more than a reply to Stephen Gosson, and this can be considered as Sidney's spirited defense of poetry against all the charges of gossip. This is considered as the first serious attempt to apply the classical rules to English poetry. Sidney wanted poetry to be to England what it was to ancient Greece and Rome. In his stress on the teaching function of poetry, he follows Plato. In his definition of poetry, he follows both Aristotle and Horace. And now, just for your knowledge, this is the full title of School of Abuse. It's actually a bit interesting. This is the complete title. You can note it down. The School of Abuse, containing a pleasant invective against poets, pipers, players, jesters, and such like caterpillars of a commonwealth, setting up the flag of defiance to their mischievous exercise and overthrowing their bulwarks of profane writers, natural reason, and common experience, a discourse as pleasant for gentlemen that favour learning, as profitable for all that will follow virtue. So, this is the exhaustive title of Stephen Gosson's School of Abuse. So, from the title itself, you can understand that there is something wrong with the whole idea of whole book, and that's why Sidney is about to defend poetry in terms of all those things that are being mentioned in School of Abuse. Gosson was essentially guided or misguided, we can say, by the spirit of Puritanism. He has described his work as a pleasant invective. We don't know whether it was a pleasant invective for the readers. When Gosson wrote this essay, he was just 24 and he just wanted instant fame. Similarly, in the case of Thomas Shadwell, when you learn Macfluckno by Dryden. Anyway, that we'll be dealing with when we deal with the neoclassical criticism. When Philip Sidney wrote his Apology for Poetry, he had in his mind Stephen's treatise, as he wished to vindicate poetry and drama against the onslaughts of the Puritans. This work was written before 1581 but remained in the manuscript till 1595. As I mentioned earlier, then only it got published. Sidney took all inspiration from the ancient classics and the Italian Renaissance writers. He drew on their writings, so on the writings of Plato, as mentioned earlier, Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Plutarch, Ovid, Virgil, Dante, and Boccaccio, all classical writers. Now we'll look into the treatise Apology for Poetry in detail. The main ideas in detail. The treatise can be divided into 4 sections. In the first section, conventional reasons are given why poetry should be especially valued. Second section has arguments on an exposition of the nature and usefulness of poetry itself. Third section proceeds to discuss the objections against poetry. Fourth section remarks on the state of English poetry and drama of Sidney's time. And we look in, there are certain major arguments which can be placed under each of these sections. So I have actually placed these arguments under these sections so that it will be easier for you to understand. So the major arguments, or the arguments that you shouldn't omit when you say something about Sidney's criticism, are, and this first one, antiquity and universality of poetry, and that comes under the section 1. The section 1 is the conventional reasons that are given why poetry should be especially valued. Okay, so antiquity and universality of poetry, and also he considers poetry as superior to history and philosophy. And now come this section 2 we mentioned earlier was he has arguments on an exposition of the nature and usefulness of poetry itself. And this consists of the nature and definition of poetry, Sidney's definition of poetry, and different kinds of poetry. Which are the poetry types of poetry that Sidney feels as important, and he talks a bit more about the contemporary English poetry. And now coming to the section 3, there actually this he talks about the chief objections towards poetry. And in the section 4, he gives an overall overview of English poetry, contemporary English poetry and drama. So these are the major arguments that are being discussed in the Apology for Poetry. So now we'll look into all these points in detail. All these headings are being expanded throughout this lecture. So first one, antiquity and universality of poetry. So the first plea advanced by Philip Sidney for the recognition of poetry is based on its antiquity and its universality and the high esteem in which it has been held from the earliest times. So he gave poetry an esteemed position. Now we look into how poetry, according to Sidney, I quote, in the noblest nations and languages that are known, have been the first light given to ignorance, and first nurse whose milk by little and little enabled them to feed afterwards of tougher knowledge, unquote. So this is what Sidney feels about poetry. And he considers all these classical poets, Greek poets, Roman poets, then Italian poets, as the masterminds behind this poetry, the history of poetry, and he considers them as the masters. So, for example, the Greek poets like Homer, Sappho, then Roman poets like Livius, Andronicus, Ennius, then Italian poets like Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. So, all these people he considered as masters of English poetry. And also he didn't forget to acknowledge Gower, Chaucer, etc., who Chaucer is considered as the father of English poetry, as you all know. He regards Plato as essentially a poet and says, more than a philosopher, he considers Plato as a poet, and he then takes the help of etymology and calls attention on the reverence paid to the poet, first by the Romans who called them a prophet or seer, and secondly by the Greeks who called them by the word poin, which means maker or creator, a description suggestive of divinity and therefore above all others. So you can see that he is giving some sort of, or attributing some sort of divinity to poets. According to Sidney, all other human arts are subordinate to nature. Poetry alone transcends nature. There you can find similarities with the concepts of Wordsworth. Then, since the poet is a maker, Shelley's defense of poetry is inspired by Sidney's apology for poetry. In order to have a better understanding, we can refer to Shelley's comment in this context. He says, "None deserves the name of creator but God and poet." So, yeah, as God, the creator, creates his own universe, the poet too has his own world of poetry. To attack poetry is to attack the roots of culture. That's what Sidney believed. To attack poetry is to attack the universality of poetry itself. Also, it is not rhyming and versing that maketh a poet. According to Sidney, he didn't believe in this conventional, this rhyme schemes or something like that. He don't think that simply rhyming makes a poetry good. Poetry, according to him, is the art of inventing new things better than this world has to offer, and even prose that does so is poetry. He concedes that verse is superior form of expression to ordinary prose. It is positively defended for its sweetness and orderliness, and being best for memory, the only handle of knowledge, it must be in jest that any man can speak against it. And by these steps, Sidney's love of the classics, especially classical poetry, is ultimately reconciled to his love of the native tradition. And now we look into the second point, that is poetry as superior to history and philosophy. Sidney looks closely at the role of philosopher as well as historian in relation to the poet. He argues that poetry is both above both history and philosophy, as the philosopher therefore and the historian as they which would win the goal by one precept or by the other by example. Because philosophers, you know that they will be having certain philosophical ideas, and historians can actually provide ample number of examples to validate something. In other words, poetry is superior to the other two in teaching the essential human virtues. Other two means this history and philosophy. Okay, then even if we consider poetry as an art or craft, following Aristotle's definition of poetry, it is superior to all. Sidney believes that poetry can move men to better, more virtuous individuals rather than simply teaching, because actually he thinks that poetry presents facts with some sort of fictional background. That is a kind of ideal world which we could read and like kind of improvise ourselves. In the promotion of virtue, both philosophy and history play their individual parts. Philosophy deals with its theoretical aspects and teaches virtue by precept, whereas history teaches practical virtue. As I mentioned earlier, philosophy is all about certain ideas or ideologies, and history gives you ample number of examples, especially concrete examples from life. The method of history is quite different from that of philosophy. A historian does not give us a theoretical analysis of virtues, but he can take examples from the past or even from the present. The philosopher dealing with abstract rules and precepts can only be understood properly by learned people, not by the youth or beginners. Historian, on the other hand, is so tied to the particular truth of things, of course, the chronology, year, etc., and not the general reason of things. That is, example, draw no necessary consequence and therefore less fruitful doctrines. But poetry combines both these aspects, both precepts and practical examples. Thus, poetry becomes superior to both philosophy and history because it combines the function of both. Hope you got an idea now. So, both these ideas are being combined together to form a new type of literary work called poetry. The poet takes up the abstract rules and universal truths of philosophy and illustrates them by vivid and concrete examples in the manner of the historian. Philosophy, being based on abstractions, cannot properly guide the youth or the unlearned people or the common folk. On the other hand, the historian is tied to empirical facts. So, poetry gives perfect pictures of virtue which are far more effective than mere definitions of philosophy or the imaginary or real examples from the history. And of course, the reward of virtue and the punishment of vice is more clearly shown in poetry than in history, because history is all about facts and proofs. Then poetry is superior to philosophy in the sense that it has the power to move and achieve virtuous action. It may be said that images and pictures of poetry are only fictitious and imaginary, therefore less important than the characters of history, which are real. Sidney gives a reply to this notion also by taking the points from Aristotle, because he considered Aristotle as a master. Poetry, he says, deals with the universal consideration and history with the particular. The world represented by poetry is an ideal and perfect world, a world more intelligible than the world of experience. Poet is therefore the monarch of all sciences, according to Sidney. Poet is considered as the right philosopher. Poetry is more philosophical and superior to history. And poetry also deals with what ought to be and therefore transcends nature without contradicting her. So, from all these points, we can confirm that the poet is indeed the right philosopher. Now, we'll move on to the next point, definition and nature of poetry. Let us look into how Sidney has defined poetry. I quote, "Poetry, therefore, is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termeth it in his word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture, with this end to teach and delight." Unquote. The key words are speaking picture, to teach and delight. These two terms are important. Speaking picture and the phrase to teach and delight are important. We'll be discussing that many times in this lecture. In the definition of poetry, he follows both Aristotle and Horace, to teach and delight. That term this is being taken from their idea. He gives emphasis to the didactic purpose of this Horatian notion that poetry must teach or delight in order to encourage and inspire people to acquire knowledge. He considers, as we know, poetry as an art of imitation, and its chief function is to teach and delight, as mentioned. Imitation doesn't mean that merely copying things or the reproduction of facts. It doesn't mean that. It means representing or transmuting of the real and actual, and sometimes creating something entirely new. Not sometimes, I would say that entirely new thing is being formulated by a poet. The poet, I quote, "lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, doth grow in effect into another nature, in making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite a new forms, such as never were in nature." Unquote. This poetic imagination is an exercise of the creative tendencies. Poets have created a world which is better and more beautiful than this real world of nature, according to Sidney. He also writes in his lyrical strain that, I quote, "Nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diverse poets have done." You might have actually come across this term, this rich tapestry, and all in many of this multiple choice questions or one word questions that you come across in the competitive exams. Anyway, coming back to the quote. "Neither with pleasant rivers, fruitful trees, sweet smelling flowers, nor whatsoever else may make the too much loved earth more lovely, her world is more brazen." Unquote. It goes on like that. It's a bit beautiful, that's why I just read it for you. In other words, it is more than mere illusion. That's what he meant. Poetry is more than mere illusion or mere imitation. The created world is an ideal world, the same idea that we have already discussed. In poetry, we find something more than mere representation of real life. That means it expresses truth of the highest kind. Both Plato as well as Aristotle has drawn parallel between poetry and painting. So this in Ars Poetica, Horace mentioned it as this picture poesis. Taking the cue from Horace, Sidney speaks of poetry as the speaking picture because it's a kind of, you know, like this intermixing of the representation of the real life plus all those imaginary things that happens in a poet's mind. And poet actually mixes this kind of imagination and reality and creates something new. That's why it is termed as a speaking picture. Now we'll move on to the next point, that is about the different kinds of poetry. Sidney classified different kinds of poetry as sacred poetry, philosophical or didactic poetry, and the right kind of poetry. These are the three major kinds of poetry he divides. Sacred poetry first, then philosophical or didactic poetry, and the right kind of poetry. We look into what the right kind of poetry is, which deals with the imaginative treatment of human life. He, by the right kind of poetry, he means the contemporary poetry that we look into in detail. The poets who write sacred poetry, the teachers of religion and prophets, are essentially theologists, hence they have their own limitations. Among the sacred poets, Sidney notes the most important ones he notes are David, Solomon, Moses, and Deborah in their hymns. The philosophical or didactic poets are restricted within their own boundaries as they are dependent for their material or on external resources because they need to bring in some sort of ideas or ideologies. So they won't be contributing anything by themselves. They need to take the ideas from outside or external sources. Among the philosophical poets, he notes Tiresias, Phocles, Cato, Lucretius, Melenius, Pontellianus, Lucan, and others. He draws special attention to the third group of poet. Third group of poet means that right kind of poetry people who imitate, that is as I mentioned, the contemporary poetry. He says that they actually write to teach and to delight, and he calls them as right poets. The poetry uh, of these poets may be subdivided into many other categories: heroic poetry, lyric poetry, then comic poetry, satiric, iambic, elegiac, pastoral, etc. He is taking this tragic comic here because he, in a larger sense, considered poetry, drama, or any other form that is written in verse as one genre that we'll deal with when we talk about his review of English poetry and drama. He considers, in a broader sense, he considers both as same. That's why this tragedy and comedy also came here. Now we look into these different sub um, divisions in detail. Sidney now focuses his attention on several kinds of poetry like pastoral poetry, elegiac poetry, satiric poetry, etc. And these three poetry, according to Sidney, are all wholesome. The pastoral poetry treats of the beauty of the simple life and sometimes of the mysteries of common people. That, of course, you know. You all are familiar with pastoral elegies. Then, elegiac poetry deals with the weakness of mankind and wretchedness of the world. It evokes pity. Satiric poetry laughs at folly, and iambic poetry tries to unmask villainy. Satiric poetry, a lot we'll be dealing with when we deal with the neoclassical criticism. So, we'll explain them. And he lays undue stress on the moral aspects of comedy. Comedy is an imitation of the common errors in our life presented in a ridiculous manner. It helps men keeping away from such errors. And as I mentioned, this is about drama. Now, coming to tragedy, of course, you know that all these tragedies include some kind of violence, at least sweet violence, and it makes us remain grounded when we realize that life is full of uncertainties. The lyric which gives moral precepts and soars to the heavens in singing the praises of the god can never be displeasing. The epic or heroic poetry inculcates virtue to the highest degree by portraying heroic and moral goodness in the most effective manner. Sidney asserts that the heroical poetry is not only a kind but the best and most accomplished kind of poetry because the classification is mostly based on subject matter and partly on the metrical consideration. Of course, you are familiar with the metrical peculiarities of heroic poetry. So he considers the third group of poets as the real makers. As Shelley said, we already have mentioned Shelley in the beginning portion. So this real makers came from this third group of poets. Shelley says, I quote, the unacknowledged legislators of the world, unquote. So Sidney makes poetry free from any kind of charges or external limitations like metrical patterns. It is not rhyming and versing that maketh a poet, according to him, no more than a large gown maketh an advocate, unquote. Verse is the outer skin and not the flesh and blood of poetry. As I mentioned, for Sidney, content is important. What he writes upon, what a poet writes upon is important, not the rhyme schemes or any other structural element. Verse is just an ornament and not essential to poetry. Rhyme and meter are not essential for poetry, but they harmonize the language. Simply rhyme and meter doesn't make a good poetry, according to Sidney. And now he takes up the most important part in this essay, that is, he is going to what the, defend poetry against the charges that are being mentioned by Stephen Gosson in his book School of Abuse. He has to defend the value of poetry in the intellectual life of the community. His plan is to inquire into the efficiency of all imaginative art and sciences, and by a comparison of their values and their various effects on the human mind, and to assign poetry its important place. So these were the we are going to look into the chief objections to poetry that are made by Gosson. Gosson talked about its uselessness. He considered poetry as useless. Then falsehood. He also considered poetry as full of lies, like Plato's opinion about poetry. Then this corrupting effect of poetry, and he is also has also taken Plato's condemnation of poetry as an evidence or a reference. Now let us look into how he is defending all these charges. First of all, first point means that poetry is useless, or simply reading it is a waste of time. Then second, poetry is deceptive, it is considered as the mother of lies. Then third, poetry is immoral, the nurse of abuse. Then fourth, Plato would have none of it, so banished poets from his Republic, from his literary work Republic. Anyway, now we look into how he defended poetry from these charges. The first of these charges, that a man might spend his time in a better way than poetry, he dismisses briefly by saying that it has been established that poetry is supreme in teaching of virtue. That was the point he made. Now let us put it in simple words. The statement that it is by denouncing the mere prerequisite for the acquisition, the poet intends to state a truth, is itself invalid. Poetry is not the falsest art. It is the truest form of art, according to Sidney. For example, he says that an astronomer or geometrician or a historian sometimes might make false statements because they are unaware of the truth. Always, we can't say that they are right. What he presents is not fact but fiction embodying truth of an ideal kind. But a poet presents a fact, but not a fact but fiction embodying truth of an ideal kind, that we already mentioned in the beginning. I quote, for the poet he nothing affirmeth, and therefore never lieth, unquote. The aim of the poet is not to tell us, I quote, what is or is not, but what should or what should not be, unquote. So that should be a poet's aim. If rightly used, poetry does most good. He also gives a reply to the third charge, that by treating love themes and its amorous conceits, poetry causes wantonness and has an effeminate influence on his readers. So it is not actually corrupting people. In answer to the effeminizing effect, Sidney says that it is the stock abuse that is already been against all learning. That is already raised against all learning. Poetry alone has the ability to rouse a man to virtuous action, so this is not right. And the fourth or the last acquisition was the most important one, or the most difficult one for Sidney to defend, as Plato was for him was the most worthy of reverence and most poetical of all the philosophers. He actually respected Plato a lot. He makes a reference to the ancient conflict between philosophy and poetry, how philosophers, after extracting their wisdom from poetry, started condemning it. So, according to Sidney, Plato was not against poetry in general, but he leveled his charges against a particular kind of poetry which would create a harmful effect on human minds and society in general. So, um, uh, yeah, Plato has warned against the abuse of poetry, as he was with all reverence described the poet in Ion. So, as Plato banishing the abuse, not the thing, not banishing it, but giving due honor to it. In fact, according to Sidney, Plato objected to the false conceptions of the god and the atheism which he found in ancient poetry and also the poets of his time. So, he was not all against poetry, but against this atheist principles and all. I quote, Plato found fault that the poets of his time filled the world with wrong opinions of the gods, making light tales of that unspotted essence, and therefore would have not the youth depraved with such opinions. Unquote. In this way, Sidney could prove that Plato was not against poetry itself but against its abuse or misuse. Then he refers to Plato's description of the ion, as mentioned earlier, as the light and winged and sacred thing, and says that this was Plato's real attitude to the poetry. Now we look into, that is how he defended the four charges against poetry. The clear purpose of the treatise itself, this apology for poetry itself, was to provide the answers for the four major charges laid down by the eminent Puritan Stephen Gosson. So that has been completed, successfully completed, we should say. And now we look into his review of English poetry and drama. Sidney now reviews, so at this point he reviews the state of poetry in England. He uses the term poetry in its original Greek sense. As I mentioned earlier, he doesn't consider poetry only. He also take literature as a whole. Literature as a whole means poetry and drama together, because novel has not been evolved at that time. So only poetry and drama are there. A threesome combination of art, imitation, and exercise goes on to make poetry successful. According to Sidney, since Chaucer, there are few good poems in England. He mentions Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside. He considered it as a good example, and also he considers Gorboduc as a good play. This the then yeah, the first tragedy, Gorboduc, as a good play. This, but he also mentions that not exactly good play, but it lacks the unities of time and place. Okay. um, Sidney prescribes that a tragedy should be tied to the laws of poetry and not of history. Sidney prescribes. So, then a dramatist should have the liberty to frame the history to his own tragical convenience. Furthermore, Sidney analyzes that tragedy is not always maintained in a well raised admiration. Comedy, on the other hand, degenerates into something farcical or immoral at this time. That, of course, the Reformation drama. When you look into the Reformation drama and all, you will understand in a better way. Now, often the laughter in comedy is confused with pleasure. He also stresses that comedy should aim at delightful teaching and not vulgar amusement. And at this time, that happened in this, especially the comedy plays. Following Castelvetro, Sidney also insists on the observance of the unities of time and place along with that of action in English drama. Sidney has no patience with this newly developed genre called tragicomedy. He was not ready to accept that as a completely new genre or completely innovative thing in the drama, in the field of drama. Then it needs to be pointed out here that Sidney's whole critical outlook in these two matters, especially regarding the unities and the tragicomedy, was affected by the absence of really good English plays at his time, till his time. According to him, English lyric poetry, which has undergone degeneration and has become tame and artificial during this age, and we'll look into why. Because he says that he discusses about the diction and style of contemporary poetry, and he says that it is verse. It is in a verse position. The writers aimed at eloquence, apparelled or rather distinguished in a courtesan like painted affection. They tried to write in affected and grandiose style, and that's why he told that this lyric poetry is under degeneration. Also, they used far-fetched words that seem doesn't make any sense, and also the affected eloquence has turned too fashionable. The metaphors are also too far-fetched, and that didn't do anything good for lyric poetry. The reason of this practice he attributes to the earlier rhetorical studies or the classical studies, and the writer was in a kind of crazy imitation towards the classical style. But the right way of acquiring such a style is not to keep up this or by hearting these words or artificially using this in your writing. As Whitney says, he says that when the writers do so, they lack the spirit, and it when they artificially make use of these words and phrases without understanding the spirit, I quote, the writers by devouring them whole and make them wholly theirs. Okay, so it lacks the essence. Now, summing up, so these are the major aspects Sidney has mentioned in his apology for poetry. Now we'll just look into the concluding portion of the treatise. Sidney takes up it's all about the language and prosody. Sidney takes up English language and prosody itself and thinks that it is a fit medium of literary expression. And no doubt, of course, English is a mingled language with so many foreign terms and all. It keeps on like enriching its vocabulary by taking these what elements, but of course Sidney says that is a good atmosphere for the poetry to develop. And the last thing taken up by Sidney is the possibility of reforming English prosody along the classical lines. He comes to a closure with the by stressing all these all his claims about poetry. All the charges laid against it are false and baseless. He reinforces that, and also he says that he ends with a request that poetry should never be degraded. Moreover, the contemporary poets were inferior. For him, contemporary poets were inferior. Already is mentioned, criticized the lyric poetry. They lacked this genuinity in writing, he says. And of course, he succeeded in giving this Puritan approach a right answer. The essay restores our, not essay, this treatise restores our faith in poetry as well as in the literature. He has not confined himself with narrow critical thoughts. Rather, his clarity and elegance makes him stand again among all other critics. One of the main tenets of 16th century Protestantism is that man is not virtuous and is incapable of doing any good to himself or to the society at large. That is being reflected in work. But Sidney viewed it in another way, and his work is reflective of the humanistic worldview. Thus, he was much ahead of his time, progressive, we should say. And then the poet hath that idea is manifest, the I quote, by delivering them forth in such excellency as he hath imagined them. These ideas undoubtedly makes Philip Sidney the father of English criticism. So that's all about the major critical aspects that are being mentioned, discussed by Sidney in his apology for poetry. I'll be back with another lecture on the neoclassical criticism in the next class. Thank you.